Unique New York. Unique New York. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, hello there. I didn't see you come in for picks of the week. Oop, picks of the week. Ba-da-ba-da-ba-doo. Well, um, how many goddamn bug bites I have? That's just 3 of many. It's disgusting. Look, they're all over my legs. And those are just the literal bloodsuckers. The figurative ones I have to deal with. Where do I want to start? I don't know where to start. First up this week, Minor Threats #1 on the Dark Horse comic book publishers. I'm not. I read a synopsis a few months ago, probably about 3 months ago, when it was first solicited. But really, all I needed to know is it's written by Patton Oswalt and Jordan Blum. Patton Oswalt is, of course, a stand-up comedian of some regard. His first album, Feeling Kind of Patton, from the, I want to say, the early 2000s, still one of the finest comedy records I've ever heard. I don't much care for the records after that, not to, uh, you know, I don't know. But he's also a huge comic book nerd, which was also, which was always, I think, one of the reasons that I enjoyed his work, even as a kid. When I was in high school, you know, he was pretty young himself. He's not much older than I am, and he had probably not been doing stand up for that long, but it was the early '90s when it was, easier to get far in stand up, which I can tell you from personal experience. I'm sure there were people back then who didn't find it all that easy either, but that's their problem. Because seriously, I know this is a bit of a sidebar. If you have Amazon Prime or just really any way to get your hands on some episodes of A&E's An Evening at the Improv, which was my favorite television program as a boy, I like watching it. I haven't watched it. I actually haven't really watched any stand up in a while, excluding, of course, uh, Seinfeld, Steve Martin, Eddie Murphy. I have to watch all 3 of them just on a regular basis. Woo! Not even 3 minutes in, already on bird walks. A&E's An Evening at the Improv was a stand-up showcase television program that ran from, I want to say, 81 or 2 all the way up through, I want to say, like 97 or 8. And boy, if you don't think stand-up was easy to do in the 80s, I defy you to watch one episode. And you could even find the one with Seinfeld, find the one with, David Spade, or find the one with comedians that you know are going to crush. I still guarantee you watch the entirety of that episode, you will walk away with the conclusion that stand-up was entirely too easy, if anything, in the 80s. I've digressed. Patton Oswalt, like I was saying, he's also a big comic book nerd, and Jordan Blum is apparently his co-writer. They wrote a MODOK miniseries, I want to say, back in 2019, maybe 2020, which was a precursor to the animated Hulu series, which I still haven't even watched. I remember the first thing Patton Oswalt wrote, comic book wise, was Justice League one shot prestige square bound book called Welcome to the Working Week, which was mostly a comedy. The MODOK series, though, was hilarious, but it was also like just, a well done comic book. Not that Welcome to the Working Week wasn't, but that did feel like a novelty sort of one off. And there was a thing there for a minute in the late aughts, I want to say, especially, where they were really throwing a lot of comic book writing work at comedians. And not flippantly either, I would say. I mean, Brian Posehn co-wrote Deadpool for a couple years with Jerry Duggan. I mean, that's not just a side gig. Like, Brian Posehn is a super nerd. I have briefly met him. I saw him once at Comic Con, and my friend Mikey and I stared at him until he frowned at us because we were being a little weird. He's a massive guy, though. I think that was, for me anyway, I was like, oh my God, look at the size of Brian Posehn. So this, I believe, is something of a humor book, but it is like a superhero team book. And I think the as the title might imply, they are youngins with superpowers. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this. And in the same vein, we have Damage Control #1. Damage Control is a Marvel book that's always been kind of close to my heart because the first miniseries came out in 1989. I want to say when I had not even been buying funny books for a year at that point, and so any new series to me was always oh I'm on the ground floor on this. And Damage Control was not the runaway success that I guess I thought it was going to be. No, I don't think it was that. I think it was just that I wanted to be able to read something from the first issue, even though they had appeared in Marvel Age Annual #2, I think, before that, which did bother me. Reading the first issue, I'm like, they're referring back to stuff. But as the title might imply, Damage Control is a company that is in charge of cleaning up after superhero fights. And it was a comedy in itself. It was created by Dwayne McDuffie and Gene Colan. It might have been one of the last things he did. In his, like, he retired, I want to say, not long after that. And he did, like, he got really sick towards the end. And he did do, I believe, an issue of, they did a one shot of Tomb of Dracula, which had been the book he was most famous for, that Ed Brubaker wrote, if I'm not mistaken. And I think they largely did it just so Gene could have a payday, because none of these guys had any kind of safety net or parachute or anything like that. So I was glad of that, and I bought an issue. Not his best stuff. I mean, he was dying. Anyway, that was a bummer of the bird walk. I do apologize. Both those guys are no longer with us, McDuffie or Colin. This is written by Adam F. Goldberg and Hans Rodenoff, who are co-creators, or maybe just the first guy of the television program, The Goldbergs. And I'm not going to say anything. I love Wendy McClendon. I will say that much. I'm looking forward to this, though. I always like Damage Control. There was, I want to say, they gave it a legacy number of 16, which means there were 15 issues of Damage Control before this, which sounds about right. 12 for sure I can remember, and then I think there may be, because they're always in limited series of 4, to my recollection. So it's weird that this one would be 16, but I think there might have been a couple one-shots in there. And that was the thing, like, they were, like, it was like a novelty book in the 90s. Maybe one more. Oh, yeah, they did do one, I believe, during Civil War, or Planet, or World War Hulk, one of those. And they would pop up every now and again, but they were they always kind of felt largely forgotten to me. So I'm excited to have them back. All right. And finally, we have AXE Judgment Day #3. Now, there's nothing of any particular, like, usually when I pick these books, they're like a #1 or maybe a final issue or something. This is right in the middle of Judgment Day. But I got to tell you, I think if you go back a few weeks, and why would you? You'll see me talking about the prologue, which was called something else. Judgment Day is the name of the event, or AXE Judgment Day. And AXE is the prefix for all the other titles, Death to Mutants, for example. I don't remember what the prologue was called now, though. But I did talk about it on here, and I think I was kind of coolish on it. That has taken a turn, and I feel like I could be overthinking this, but I don't think so. What and I think a lot of big comic book nerds have been kind of experiencing lately is event fatigue. There's a big crossover every year. It's been that way since '84, and it's only increased lately. And there were like no fewer than 3 crossovers: Devil's Reign, Reckoning War, and the third one that I can never remember, but I'll have to look up again. It's just too much. There's too many events. There's too many big things happening. And this is something that I feel like Marvel editorial forgets on occasion. They're like, they just keep throwing event books at us. And in that way, there's more books. They get to charge you a little extra. I mean, the cover price on all of these is $5 as opposed to 4. And it's just a lot. And I feel like going into this series, I was definitely feeling it. And I get a general vibe that most Marvel nerds are too. But this, and it's probably not a big deal, but there has been a twist in this storyline. The basic storyline, as it was sort of pitched, was the X-Men mutants in general have figured out a way to resurrect themselves. So they are immortal, effectively. The Eternals, who are immortal, are like, no, I don't think that's... And over in the Eternals book, also, there's been a lot of... leading up to this event, there was a lot of skullduggery, which ended up with Druig as the Prime Eternal, and with Thanos as like his back, his muscle, essentially. Shadow Council or whatever. But Thanos is involved, it's not, or Thanos, however you want to say. So Druig is the one who's like, well, the point of the Eternals is to curb excess deviation. The Eternals were put on Earth by the Celestials, who are essentially gods. The Eternals were put on Earth by the Celestials millions of years ago, as were the Deviants. And so the Eternals' job was to make sure the Deviants never got out of control and killed humans and stuff. But Druig is saying that, well, essentially the mutants are deviants, which is not entirely true. Even by Marvel lore, they're a separate race entirely. And, or species, I guess, would be a better way to put it. But Druig says, well, this is definitely excess deviation. They've gone beyond. And it's, very clearly, like, we're Eternals. You're not Eternals. That's like, they're not even trying to hide that. But it's also, since Druig is kind of a puppet dictator, he's whipping up, fomenting unrest against the mutants to distract from the fact that he and Thanos are running things for the Eternals. And the Avengers are stuck in the middle. The Avengers are like, hey, we've had our differences with the X-Men. We've sort of had our differences with the Eternals. I don't know that that's true, actually. We've had several X-Men on the team. We've had several Eternals on the team. We don't want a war going on, for Christ's sake. So they're kind of stuck in the middle. And they're also, the Avengers' current headquarters is in the body of a Celestial in the North Pole. So as this series has gone on, that Celestial, who had been dead for millions of years, has resurrected and is like, oh, I'll put an end to this right now. You have 24 hours, planet Earth, you have 24 hours to prove your worth. And if you fail to do so, we're going to destroy the planet. Oh. So this is my theory here, is that going into, and this is all Kieran Gillen is the head writer on this event. And he's a great writer. I've been a big fan of his going back 10, 12 years at least. What was the first thing? Gosh, I don't remember. Him and Jamie McKelvey were a team very early on. And one of the first things I remember them doing was a book called Phonogram, which I still haven't read, but I do own. They also did a book called The Wicked and the Divine, which I enjoyed. But then when they started doing more Marvel stuff, that was when I got into them. And Gillen wrote Uncanny X-Men for a good while that I really enjoyed, and McKelvey might have drawn that too, but I can't quite recall. Jamie McKelvey just wrote the Captain Carter series that Marvel published. Anyway, it feels like going into this, the event was kind of like, we're going to pit all three of these together, and my response was like, okay, sure, that sounds fun, I guess. But I wasn't excited about it. But now it's become a much different story where it's like, oh, we're only 2 issues into the event proper, I mean, 4 technically, but 2 issues into the event proper, and oh no, it's a much different story. It is now essentially the Celestials versus Earth, and now I'm excited. Now I want to. That's why I picked it, because I want to read it. I want it to be one of the first books I read for Picks of the Week. Picks of last week. Well, I'm sorry, you guys. Last week was kind of a shorter one, and now I'm going to go on for a bit because I did finally catch up on all my funny books. And I'm going to immediately fall behind this week because I will be house sitting in Long Beach for the rest of the week. But let's just get right down into it. First up was Jimmy's Little Bastards, #1. This is great fun, as expected. Rule of threes. Very important. So he never really did a recap, but he did kind of touch back on the previous issue. This is a daughter of Jimmy here, the James Bond character of this series. And that was a reveal, I think, at the end, or maybe halfway through the first series, that she was like his Moneypenny, sort of. And, you know, he was, of course, being a scumbag. And then they found out that he was her father, so that put paid to that. At the end of the first series, Jimmy has become less of a piece of shit and, like, soft now. Hence the Christmas sweater and the model airplane. And now a new threat is looming, and so Jimmy's kind of coming out of retirement a little bit, and it's good. I forget how good Russ Braun is. I don't know that I knew his work before The Boys, and even then it was kind of like he was kind of working from The Boys, as I mentioned, is my favorite comic book of all time, created by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson, who are two of my favorite comic book creators. But Derek Robertson, for whatever reason, I think he's one of these guys that just draws really slowly. So there were huge chunks of that series that he did not draw. And I was always mad about it. Peter Snedberg, and I'm not sure that's how his name is pronounced, and Russ Braun kind of split duties. I think Carlos Ezquerra, who was mostly known for Judge Dredd, and who Ennis had worked with before, and always, I feel like he brings Ezquerra in whenever he can. And I think John McCrea, same deal. John McCrea and Garth Ennis started on the Demon together. They might have worked before that, for 2000 AD, but the first thing I saw them do was the Demon, and then Hitman, and then they've done other books here and there. I think Six Pack was the last one they did. Six Pack and Dog Welder. Underrated series that I'd even forgotten about until recently. But it was mostly, those were like they did a few mini series during the run of The Boys, which were connected to the main story but also separate. So those are usually drawn by McCrea or Ezquerra. And I am rereading The Boys currently again for like the 4th or 5th time now. So that's what I've gone back. Snedberg, I still don't much care for, if I'm being honest, his work anyway on The Boys. It just doesn't do it for me. But Russ Braun is really good. I mean, I could show you the cover again, but yeah, he's a great artist. And so I'm glad that they're doing more stuff together. And I feel like in my head, I was just always like, well, he's not Derek Robertson. So I didn't give him a fair shake. But rereading him now, man, this stuff is super good. Okay. What else did I want to do? All right, these are probably... I mean, this was another sequel, like Jimmy's Little Bastards, which I guess doesn't mean much if you haven't read the first one. It's Shirtless Bear Fighter, though. Like I said last week, it's a guy without a shirt who fights bears. It's very fun. It's very good. This one I remember liking, but it's one of those ones... I mean, I did read it a week ago, so I need to refresh my memory, and it's harder to do. I am no longer wearing progressive lenses because they kept getting scratched up way too easily. So now I'm back on the single visions, and I have to use reading glasses. So this is a this is right. This is a very very Christopher Priest, very heavy metal superhero sort of story. It spans uh, thousands of years, et cetera, and it's kind of hard at this point to say what exactly is going on. Not that it's, I mean, I could, but for one thing, I've already babbled on for too long. But it's very Christopher Priest, and that's what I like. I'm on board for that. Maybe I'll bring the second issue up next week. All right. I read The Last Shadowhawk, and it sucked. I mean, because the other thing is, I did finally finish the Shadowhawk Chronicles, Volume 1. This has the first 18 issues of Shadowhawk, as well as, not all, but some of the other uh, like one-off stories that Valentino did. Now, this is all Philip Tan doing this, and having read the entire series, or at least the first 18 issues, which to my knowledge are the only issues, none of this rang a bell. Like, there's another race, a very celestial-like race. We'll get to that in a minute. And it's essentially the death of Shadowhawk occurs in this issue. Now, it's very Shadowhawk, and Philip Tan is I mean, he might even be like one of Valentino's. Valentino, I think, might have been a mentor, because they do have very, very similar styles. And it was satisfying in that, it was an end to the story, but I just can't say it, and I can't say it in a nice way. This book sucks hard. It's a lot of fun to read, but boy. So, first of all, I would like to draw your attention to the absolutely inexcusably shitty reproduction. I gotta find one where it really works. I don't know if you can really tell, but all they did here was photocopy every issue of Shadowhawk and jam it into some cheap binding. And not even the fucking original art. They photocopy color comics into black and white. They didn't half tone it. They didn't do anything. And it just looks like complete shit. And it's like, man, nobody's reading Shadowhawk for the story. If you're not going to reproduce the art, even for admittedly, this was, well, I don't know, because this is a very similar format. Marvel and DC both, they don't do this anymore. But Marvel had a line called Milestones is the fancy color hardcover one. Essential, or is DC Essential? Marvel's was called Essentials. DC was called Showcase. And they were big, thick, like phone books. Reprints of old comics, mostly from the 60s and 70s. Stuff that hadn't been collected in a color trade paperback at that point. And I think the thinking there, because it took forever for the big two to realize what a big seller trade paperbacks are. So back then they were like, why don't we put a bunch of this old shit in a ton of it. It'll be more about quantity than quality. It'll be black and white, but it'll only be $15. And then college guys will keep them in their bathrooms to read when they're on the can. And that's essentially, I think, what happened. But even those reproductions, whether they were in black and white, they were still scanned from the original art, for Christ's sake. And they looked good. You could read them. You can't barely even read this. And I can't stress enough that I'm really, really don't want to be disrespectful to James Valentino, but first of all, Shadowhawk has claws that come out of there's 4 of them per hand. Oh, it's completely different. That's not at all. Wolverine has 3 claws, that's less claws than what Shadowhawk has. Totally different. There's an issue where Shadowhawk finds himself in Antarctica, and there's a secret, prehistoric jungle underneath Antarctica. Not on top of Antarctica, like in Marvel Comics, where you have the Savage Land. No, this is beneath Antarctica. Good God. This was why I stopped reading superhero comics in the 90s. It's funny now, but as a kid, I was like, I'm spending money on this crap. $2 an issue, which was, $1,994. And it's just so bad. Do I enjoy it? Immensely. But I cannot say it enough. Terrible comics. And that was the thing. That was definitely the problem with Image Comics in the early days. Was that these guys who started Image Comics, they were all rock star artists over at Marvel and DC. And they were just that. They were artists. They were pencilers. They were not writers. And you don't need to read more than a couple issues of that early stuff. And I'm not just picking on Shadowhawk here. You can read fucking Wildcats, Youngblood, Spawn even. I know everybody loves... People still really love Spawn. All right. Cyberforce, Stormwatch, any of that crap. Brigade. Because that was the thing, too. It wasn't just like the first couple months. It was like the first few years. And they were all complete ripoffs of Marvel. Oh, this is one thing I did want to mention. There is one thing that early Image Comics did, and I don't know how I want to phrase this exactly. Spawn is black. I don't know if you knew that. Shadowhawk also black. Chapel, who is not Cable because he's black, and named Chapel, leader of Youngblood, black. Far more black characters in the early days of Image than were at Marvel or DC at the time, or at least as many. And it really, then especially, it really felt like not tokenism, but these guys were like, we want to do different. We don't want to be the same as Marvel and DC, even though they were. They're like, what if we had more black characters? And I think that's the one thing they got right. None of these guys were black. They weren't all white, but none of them were black, to my recollection. Until Larry Stroman came on board with Tribe, which, as I recall, wasn't very good, as much as I love Larry Stroman. I wonder what he's doing now. Anyway. That was something, reading this again, that I was like, oh yeah, that was something Image. And nobody really talks about it. I think that's probably why. Because now you don't want to have black characters only written by white guys or non-black people, I guess. But at the time, I remember noticing it and being like, yeah, great. This is good. We need more black characters. And I was very woke in 9th grade. Here are two that I did not talk about last week, but which I'm aching to talk about. So Above Snakes #2. I talked about #1. It was really, really good. And I was reading this issue, enjoying it as well. And I get to the letters page. Who's this guy? Again. There's me. First letter in the letters page. Above Snakes #2. I honestly had forgotten that I'd written them a letter. But yeah, I was just kind of, I do that a lot. Usually about once a week, I want to say. I read a lot. And it's not just comics either. In fact, I just got an email back, a reply email from an author, Bonnie Jo Stiffelberg, I think is her name. I read a short story of hers. I can't remember which. I've been reading a lot of sci-fi and horror anthology magazines. But yeah, I do this a lot. Whenever I read something that I particularly like, which is pretty often, if possible, and it usually is given the internet, I like to bang out a quick note. Usually not, and that's the thing, I think I've said this before, is I intentionally keep it as brief as possible, but still very nice. So that was fun. This is the best comic book I've read this year. I think I'll go that far. This is True Cult #1. I think that's how it's pronounced, because these are V's and not U's, as you might imagine. Now, our main character, Marty, here, works at Burger Lord, and has done for the last 15 years. And in that time, he has hatched himself the best possible heist that he could. And of course, he deviates only slightly from the plan. Things start to go a bit nutty. Now, I did write them a letter immediately after reading this. And it was just, and I've not heard of Scott Bryan Wilson and Liana Kangas are the creative team on this book. I'm not familiar with the work. I picked this up because it's on IDW, San Diego's own IDW, and they had sent out a preview book with like a few pages from a bunch of books they have coming out. and this was one of them. And I read that one. I went, oh, I didn't even. I think I read the first 2 pages, and I went, nope, I want to read that when it comes out. And boy, am I glad that I did. I've always been a big fan of crime fiction, even though I don't read nearly as much of it as I used to, or write as much of it as I used to. That at one point was my main ambition, was to be a crime novelist, and wouldn't turn it down either. I just don't write that much of it anymore. There's a devil worshipping cult in this, which has always appealed to me. And my very, very, very first job at the ripe age of 18 was the drive-through at Carl's Jr. So this thing, and I mean, I think most people in this country worked in fast food at some point. So I mean, there's nothing in here I can't relate to except that the lead character likes hair metal, which I almost feel like they're like, we should put something that Jimmy is not into, just to, because otherwise I would just assume I lived in this comic. So I can't recommend this enough. Even if you're not much of a funny book reader and or what have you, I highly recommend tracking this down. Super good stuff, and just really, I mean, aesthetically, it's very good. Like the art is good, and there's also, but you don't see this all the time. There's an aesthetic. There's a colored design. You don't always see that. I don't think. I don't always notice that sort of thing, but that's what I mean. Since I don't see it a lot, and then when I do, I'm like, oh wow, then it really stands out. Sorry for going over half an hour